Now, as you heard earlier, January 15th is a date that sits uncomfortably in Nigeria's history. On this day in 1966, Nigeria's first military coup shattered this country's young democracy, killing political leaders, altering the balance of power, and setting the nation on a path of military rule, civil war, and decades of instability. Yet today, January 15th, is also marked as Armed Forces Remembrance Day, a day meant to honor the men and women who've served, fought, and died in defense of this country. So how do we reconcile remembrance with rupture? How does a nation honor its soldiers on the very anniversary of a coup that changed its destiny? Is January 15th a day of sacrifice, a day of sorrow, or a reminder of unresolved questions about power, unity, and the role of the military in Nigeria's democracy? Well, tonight, as we confront the meaning of a date that continues to shape Nigeria's past and its present, I'm joined now in the studio by a man who lived through those heady days of 1966, Professor Jibrin Ibrahim, who's since become a historian, noted political scientist, senior fellow at the Center for Democracy and Development, and chair of the editorial board of Premium Times newspaper. Prof, thank you very much indeed for coming in.
Always a pleasure.
And let me seize this opportunity to say Happy New Year, because we haven't seen this
Thank you.
yet.
Yes, indeed.
So help us to draw on your lived experience, your scholarly authority, and your democratic credentials, because you were alive in 1966. What do you personally remember about January 15th, and how different does that moment feel when you reflect on it now as a political historian?
Actually, I was living in number 1 Awolowo Way in Lagos because my sister picked me up from primary school in Kano, and so she's transferring me to Lagos to finish my primary school. I was 11. Her husband was a prison officer. Then the coup happened, and of course the Ikoyi prison where he worked was a central place where people were arrested and taken. And virtually every evening we had running narratives on what was going on politically, who had been killed, who had not been killed, who had been detained, and who was in jail. So I didn't quite understand what was going on then. I was just 11 years old. But the political drama was really heavy on me, and maybe that was one of the reasons I later decided to study political science, maybe to understand it.
Indeed. And of course...
So, well,
yeah,
just to finish on that, of course, given the coup and what happened, the decision was I should go back to Kano, and I went back to Kano. And we lived in Sabongari, and the area where we lived was full of essentially Igbo people. And when the Arewa pogrom started, our houses were all attacked. The army came in, and when I came out the next morning, I mean, we were spared because we were not the ones they were looking for. And that was, of course, a big trauma that has remained with me all my life. But the biggest impact was the next morning. I foolishly came out of the house, and all my neighbors' kids that I was playing with and all that were all killed, and their bodies were in the streets. That's part of the reason why so many of us in this country have been traumatized for a very long time, and our lives have lived through episode after episode of trauma.
That's an extraordinary story. And I know you were quite young at the time, but as I said, you are a political scientist and a political historian, so you're able to look back and put that period in some context and perspective. At the time, did ordinary Nigerians see the January 15th coup as a rescue mission, a betrayal of democracy, or something else entirely? Or did it depend on which part of the country you came from?
I think to a large extent it depended on which part of the country you came from, because what happened on 15 January the pattern of those who are killed and those who are not killed gave the whole episode an ethnic agenda, and therefore that colored a lot what was happening. But I think over and beyond that, people were conscious even at that time that there was a problem with the political system. It wasn't delivering. Corruption had eaten deeply. And you will recall that after the coup occurred, many people came out to praise the young majors because they felt corruption that had become a real problem would now be dealt with decisively by these young persons. And in my column tomorrow, I come back to some of these issues, including...
And that column is in the Premium Times.
That's right, including Tai Solarin, who did this celebratory article in Daily Times at that time about how corruption will be ended immediately with the army. And 8 years later, in his famous position paper at the beginning of the end, he declared that, oh, it turns out the soldiers were even more corrupt than the politicians were worrying about. So that, in a sense, that's the trauma and drama of Nigerian politics since the 1960s.
It's fascinating. And looking back 6 decades later, what do you consider the single most damaging consequence of the 1966 coup for Nigeria's political development?
I think what it did was erode the belief that we could fix our democracy. And there was a sense in which the political class had real problems, but the problems that existed were structural problems. You recall that in the politics of the First Republic, we had a very unbalanced federation because the North alone, there are 3 regions, and the North alone had 70% of the territory of the country and 55% of the population, and could therefore be a perpetually dominant force in the political system. The British were asked to resolve this problem before independence during the 1958 Willings Commission, and they refused and said, no, that's the way they wanted us to go to independence, knowing fully well that structural imbalance will create difficulties. Now, when the military came, I think one thing they did was to address that problem of political structure by the creation of 12 states. But what defeated the military was the corruption element of the equation, because rather than stop corruption, as Nzegu has promised on 15 January 1966, corruption continued to grow throughout the 30 years of military rule. Of course, now the soldiers can look back and say, well, the politicians that came after us have now beaten all our records of corruption, and that therefore corruption is the winner in terms of Nigeria's politics and political economy.
It's a sad commentary on this country, but great analysis by you. But you mentioned earlier the issue of the way the British sort of divvied up the country, if you like, and the ethnic problems that resulted from that. Did that coup merely expose existing ethnic and political tensions, or did it actively deepen and perhaps even institutionalize them?
I think those differences existed. Don't forget there were 2 major issues that led to the coup. One was the suspicion of the inflation of census numbers in the 1962 census, and that census had to be repeated the following year. The second was the 1964 elections, in which the ruling party in northern Nigeria made sure opposition parties in the north were not able to nominate candidates for elections because the officer who collected nomination forms in the Ministry of Internal Affairs simply disappeared after collecting the forms from the MPC. And therefore, there was that deep sense of political cheating that people felt, and that anger was very much what mobilized the young military officers into the action in which they took. And the idea, as General Musa was saying earlier, was that you can't have justice when this level of manipulation occurs, especially as the fundamentals were already heavily weighed in one direction. And therefore, it was a search to correct the political imbalances that exist and to return the country to the path of justice. Of course, that didn't happen because even the coup and the killings that occurred were one-sided and therefore felt injustice was only being deepened rather than alleviated.
But was there a sense amongst, I suppose, intellectual circles like yours, although you were still a kid at the time, that the counter-coup of July 1966 to some extent had corrected that one-sidedness that you're talking about, and therefore the country should have healed and said, okay, we've all sort of slaughtered each other, let's kind of move on from here?
Well, I think there was that sense, especially with the end of the Civil War and the attitude General Gawan took in terms of letting bygones be bygones and starting on a new plate. And in a sense, that should have worked. But I think there are a number of reasons why it didn't work. In particular, the fact that the military started enjoying being in positions of power and started
they became politicized.
Yeah, they became politicized, started doing what the politicians were doing, and then started manipulating transition process. And when Tai Solarin published his Beginning of the End, when Gawan postponed the transition of 1976, that became a clear sign to Nigerians that we are not really out of the woods yet, because what's happening is that these new actors are learning, have learned the manipulation of the old political class and are practicing it even better. And of course, when subsequently Gawan made the declaration that well, they can't quite transit now because the Queen was coming and he'd want all his governors and all that to be there ready to receive the Queen. And then Nigerians started wondering, well, we are in trouble as Nigerians. We are suffering from all sorts of things. Why is the visit of the Queen going to determine our political future?
Indeed.
And there the questions started appearing.
Now, other countries, in Africa, I mean South Africa, Rwanda, they've confronted painful historical ruptures through truth-telling and, if you like, memorialization. Has Nigeria ever honestly reckoned with 1966 or the subsequent civil war?
Not really. Under Obasanjo, there was a peace commission that was established.
The Oputa Commission.
The Oputa Commission. And a lot of things were said, but that didn't have any impact because there was no action taken about anything. So it was just a talk shop in which people came and said certain things. And the irony now is, of course, the majority of young Nigerians don't even know that Oputa Commission existed. And what was said was never really popularized because there are lots of very good lessons in terms of the testimonies people made that could have been used to start building confidence in the future of the country and preparing people to move forward and stop focusing on past misdeeds. But nothing was ever done with that. Because, I mean, in Rwanda, what they did was to rebuild the nation on the basis of what the Gashasha Commission came up with.
Let's look at the lessons for today. We're almost out of time. With growing public frustration over governance in this country, what lessons should Nigerians draw from 1966?
I think the main lesson to draw is that 1966 was really a cry out that democracy was crumbling. Today, what everybody is saying, democracy is crumbling. Yes, we've had a democratic regime for 26 years, but read the papers, listen to the radio, talk to Nigerians. What everybody is saying is that that democracy that we have today is being emptied of its rules, of its principles, of its institutions, and manipulation is ongoing, and that therefore Nigerians who are so committed to democracy are now very concerned that we have essentially lost that democracy. We've lost our own basic foundational principles of federalism, and what therefore represents this Nigeria to the Nigerian citizen. That's the question being posed today.
So if January 15th is meant to teach Nigeria one enduring lesson, what should that lesson be, and have we truly learned it?
I think it would be good for Nigerians today to read the message of Major Chukwuma Nzegu when he carried out the coup, because it was really a political analysis of how the politics of the First Republic was crumbling due to domination and due to misuse or abuse of power. The way in which the regional governments were using the native authority police, the native authority courts to lock up opposition, to prevent opposition from contesting elections, how there was so much manipulation of the electoral process itself, and how corruption was becoming a real problem. These were the reasons that led to the coup. And I think when people read that today, they start making comparisons with what's going on today. That's saying we should have learned a lesson. We haven't learned that lesson.
On that very sobering note, Prof, I want to thank you very much indeed. Absolutely sterling analysis. Professor Jibrin Ibrahim is a political historian, noted political scientist, senior fellow at the Center for Democracy and Development, and chair of the editorial board of Premium Times newspaper. Thank you very much indeed.
Always a pleasure.
That's it for this edition of Arise Prime Time. Join us again tomorrow. From me and the entire team here in Abuja, bye-bye and thank you for watching.